Welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon. I'm Dr. Rita Sakr, lecturer in postcolonial and global literatures in the Department of English at Maynooth University. This is the second event in the Interculturalism, Literature and the Arts in Ireland series. In the first webinar, we engaged with the centrality of human rights and diversity to interculturalism in Ireland, with the guests of the event, Mary Moynihan of Smashing Times and Sandrine Dahiro of Unapologetic magazine. Today, we will be exploring intercultural literary initiatives connecting Ireland to the world by talking translations with Sinéad Mac Aodha, Director of Literature Ireland, the National Agency for the Promotion of Irish Literature Abroad. Through various programs and collaborative initiatives, Literature Ireland has been building an international awareness and appreciation of contemporary Irish literature, primarily in translation. And among these is the translation grant program for publishers to fund the translation of literature from Ireland, whether in English or Irish, into foreign languages. Another brilliant initiative is Talking Translation that brings together Irish writers and their translators in a podcast. Sinéad is a former judge of the Irish Times Theatre Awards. She also sits on the jury for the Rooney Prize and is a member of Words Ireland, of the steering committee for the Franco-Irish Literature Festival, the management committee of the UNESCO City of Literature, Dublin, and also of the EU Working Group on Translation and Multilingualism. Sinéad will be in conversation with my colleague, Oisín Fagan, who is writer in residence in the English department for this year. Over the past 5 years, Oisín has published 3 stunning books, one a novella, The Hierophant, that won the Penny Dreadful Novella Prize in 2016, an acclaimed collection of stories, Hostages, published in 2016 by New Island Press and in 2018 by Head of Zeus, and a novel, Nobber, published in 2019 by John Murray Originals. Nobber was shortlisted for the Bollinger Everyman Wodehouse Prize for the Butler Literary Award, but also longlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize and named as one of the books of the year by The Guardian and the Daily Mail. Oisín and I would like to thank Professor Lauren Arrington, Head of Department of English, and for supporting the Interculturalism, Literature and the Arts series, and our colleague Tracy O'Flaherty for promoting and digitally enabling this event. After Sinéad's talk and the conversation, I will come back near the end for the Q&A section. So in the meantime, please do send your comments and questions at any point through the chat function. This webinar is being recorded. Sinéad, we are very pleased to have you with us tonight and to hear about the crucial role of Literature Ireland in enabling these translational collaborations.
Thank you very much, Rita. It's a great pleasure to join you this afternoon and to have the opportunity to speak with you and Oisín about the work of Literature Ireland. To give you a little bit of background about the organisation, it was established in 1994 and its aim was to bring the literature of Ireland to the world. This came about as a result of a piece of research which had revealed that much of Ireland's contemporary literature was simply not being translated, was not being appreciated across the world. And it was felt that given the quality of that work, a huge opportunity was being lost, and that it was an important possibility in terms of building bridges if Ireland's literature could be disseminated more widely. So those cultural bridges needed to be built and built fast. The organisation was established at the very end of 1994 and began its first year of operation in 1995. And just 12 books were published in translation that year with the support of what was then called Ireland Literature Exchange. We've travelled some journey in the meantime and can now boast of almost 2,500 titles in 57 languages. So how did we travel from 1994 to November 2021? Well, initially the organisation was established in just one room in the Irish Writers' Centre in 19 Parnell Square. As one staff member reached out to the world. We used faxes in those days and a lot of post to encourage publishers right across the world to take an interest in Irish literature and to apply for translation subsidies. Over time, it was decided that a catalogue showcasing what was available in a given year should be published and circulated both by post and at book fairs. Book fairs have become a crucial element in the quiver of arrows that we use in order to send Irish literature across the world. They're an essential communication forum in which to meet publishers and translators. In 1996, Ireland was a guest of honour at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and suddenly the role and importance of Ireland Literature Exchange was increased tenfold. It became a pivotal element in the promotion of Irish literature in that very special year when literature was being celebrated at the Frankfurt Book Fair. Frankfurt Book Fair is the most important book fair in the world, and publishers from all corners of the world attend that book fair in order to buy and sell foreign language rights. Since that time, the organisation has expanded. So at that time, it was really focused simply on the awarding of translation grants, and that is still its core activity. It supports translations in Argentina and China, Russia and Brazil, and it's actively attempting to reach more and more publishers and to bring more writers to readers across the world. But it has also developed new programs to support that promotional work. One very important one in terms of intercultural dialogue and exchange is the awarding of residential bursaries to literary translators. So we host on a selective basis translators from different territories. We bring them to Ireland and immerse them in the culture. We want them to have as full an experience of Irish culture as possible, because we know that this enhances the quality of the translations. And that's a service not just to the translators, but also to the authors of the original works. It's a huge privilege to host translators in Ireland and to introduce them to our country and to the specific culture and locale of the books that they're translating. My team and I think, probably enjoy that aspect of the work more than any other. It also creates a long-term relationship with those translators, and they can become ambassadors for Irish literature. To give you some examples of the kinds of work we've done in hosting translators here, we did arrange at one stage for a translator to meet a thatcher, because the translator in question was translating a poem by Seamus Heaney in which there were references to thatching. We didn't quite expect that the translator would climb up onto the roof in order to see exactly how the thatcher thatched a roof, but he did and lived to tell the tale, thankfully. And I have no doubt but that translation was greatly enhanced by that experience. I know of an Italian translator whom we sent to the west of Ireland when she was translating Edna O'Brien's novels, and she managed to talk her way into Edna's family home. There were builders doing work on the house at the time, and she sweet-talked them into letting her walk around the space because she wanted to feel what the configuration of those rooms was like before she translated Edna's novels. In terms of other work, we are invited very often to serve as a resource center to provide guidance and information to journalists, to diplomats, to festival programmers right across the world. So in the past month, for example, I've arranged for 2 Irish writers to participate in a festival in Mumbai. I've helped organize a trip for a writer, a physical trip for a writer to a festival in Valparaiso. And soon we'll be programming events for the new year, probably a combination of virtual and real life participation for those authors. Why is this important? Well, it's very important because it gives the authors a chance to meet their readers. In some cases, it gives the authors a chance to meet with publishers who may choose to publish their work in future. I know, for example, that John Banville participated in an event in Shanghai, and there was a man in the audience who was so taken by John's words that he signed 5 of John's novels up for publication in China. So those kinds of connections can be crucial in terms of building relationships and giving authors a chance to promote the work and to get a sense for the territories in which their work is being published. Intercultural dialogue, I think was a term you used earlier, Rita, is crucial. It's so important that the author and the translator meet, that the translator has an understanding of the personality of the author. It's not, translations can happen without that, of course, but if the translator has a deep understanding of the personality that originated the work, I think that also improves the quality of the translations. It also allows for queries to occur in a very natural and friendly environment. I often encourage translators not to get in touch with their writers until they're nearly finished. And then when they have struggled with certain key elements, to approach with the really crucial questions. Obviously, over time, the relationship between a writer and his or her translator cements and becomes deeper and stronger, and that can lead to lots of interesting projects. It also means that both the translator and the author are more relaxed on stage when they present works to an audience. In terms of other projects, well, we feel that when we are assessing translation grant applications, our core activity, it's very important that we assess the quality of the translation, of the sample translations that are submitted to us when publishers are seeking a subsidy. It's quite fraught. It's a complicated system because sometimes it's a question of, subjective choices. Sometimes a sample is submitted before it's quite ready for assessment. In order to make things as fair as possible, we send sample translations anonymously to independent experts for assessment. And we ask them to look at the work and decide whether or not it reaches a threshold of quality which would suggest that the work should be supported by Literature Ireland and that it would do good service to the author, that it's not going to damage the author in any way in the target language. The questions we ask include, is the work flowing? Does it read well in the target language? Are there omissions? Are there cultural specificities that have been well rendered in the target language? To give you an example, I have an Argentinian friend who, when he came to Ireland, and I said, we're going to go up the hill there to that coffee shop at the top of the hill. He said, that's a hill? Because hills in Ireland are very low when compared to hills in other parts of the world. In fact, I think a mountain in Ireland is 1,000 meters. So it is that right? 1,000 meters? I think it's much, much lower than in other countries. The weather in Ireland is very different. The use of the umbrella is different. The smell of the pub the morning after the night before. What's a storm? All these things are quite specific to a culture. And so we feel that it's important to assess the sample translations before a translation grant is awarded. To go back to Rita's introduction, I think it might be interesting for the audience this afternoon to see some of the titles that we've supported in translation. And so I'm going to try now to show you some of the books that we have supported in the past. So initially, I thought I'd just show you our logo. So as you can see, the logo and the name of the organization has changed over time. Initially, we were called Ireland Literature Exchange, and we used an old Ogham script there to denote the ILE. We have problems with the name of the organization because the implication of those words is that there is an equal exchange between literature coming in and literature going out. And actually, Literature Ireland's remit is primarily the promotion of Irish literature abroad. We changed about 5 years ago and rebranded, and we're now called Literature. We now trade as Literature Ireland with the tagline promoting and translating Irish writing. Here is an example of some of the titles we've supported. You can see Emily Pine there in Spanish, her book Notes to Self. You can see Jan Carson's work, The Firestarters, in Spanish, and Danielle McLaughlin's short stories, which were published in Uruguay. I think the title there in Spanish is Dinosaurs and Other Planets. Here are some titles in French. Dara McNulty's lovely book, Diary of a Young Naturalist, Keelan Hughes, and Sarah Bohm's Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, which rather fascinatingly in French has a completely different title, Dans la baie fauve. So is it Literature Ireland's role to question the choice of titles? We think probably not. We have to respect publishers' choices for their territories. However, the lyricism of Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither is definitely lost in this particular French title, Dans la baie fauve. Here we have some examples in Italian. Nisha Dolan's Exciting Times. We've got Seamus Heaney's Fieldwork, and Christine Dwyer-Hickey's novel there, which again, the title was changed quite radically. In German, some stories by Nicola Flattery, novel by John Boyne, and very topically, because it's just out, Colm Tóibín's The Magician, and his book inspired by the life of Thomas Mann. Norwegian translation of Mike McCormick's novel Solar Bones, some of Paul Muldoon's poetry there in the middle in Swedish, Donald Ryan's, one of Donald Ryan's novels in German, no, that's not German, in Dutch, and we also support Irish language translations, so that's An Ucher, Mortin O'Kine's An Ucher in Czech. We support classic literature as well as contemporary literature. Here you have John McGahern's Amongst Women, Maggie O'Farrell's novel, and Sally Rooney. We recently supported Sally Rooney's Normal People in Galician. So you could argue that that is a strange choice given how few people speak Galician. However, we felt that it was worth supporting the translation of such a world famous work in such a small language. We also feel that if publishers are paying Ireland the compliment of wanting to translate Irish writers into their languages, that where possible, we should try to encourage and support that. I really do believe that the translation of Irish literature makes friends for Ireland. If people read your literature, they get to know you. Here we have some translations of works into non-Roman scripts. And again, I think both I and my colleagues really love it when books like this come into the office, because they're so fascinating and so exotic. So here we have normal people in Belarusian. We have Morchin O'Kine's Cranachilla in Greek. And we have Frank O'Connor in Bulgarian. My colleague's here beside me, so she's helping me. Thank you. Looking to Asia, and Asia is obviously much more complicated in terms of the promotion of Irish literature, simply because of the geographic and cultural distances. So we have Beckett there in Korean, just pretty fascinating. So it's Murphy translated into Korean. That's a title that we recently took delivery of. We have Mary Costello's Academy Street in Vietnamese. And we have Seamus Cullen Tobin in Japanese on the right there. Here we have some work in Chinese, Paddy Clark Ha, which is just in. And that's another lovely thing about the work that we do. We can very often give life to authors' backlists. So we're revitalizing a backlist. I mean, Paddy Clark Ha must have been published over 20 years ago. And here it is just appearing in Chinese. And this creates an interesting income stream from work which the writer has produced many years ago. I absolutely love this title, this cover of Sally Rooney's Normal People. And then we have the House of Names in Chinese as well. Arabic and Persian titles. We have a Cranachilla in Arabic. We've been working recently with a number of Egyptian publishers. We have Ulysses in Persian, and we have a Christine Dry-Hickey novel Tati, which was published in Arabic a couple of years ago. We also support children's titles, and that's often quite interesting because, of course, the dimension of illustration comes into play. In this case, a translator of Irish poetry who was visiting Ireland came across this children's story by Louis MacNeice in the National Library and fell in love with it. Several years later, she secured the rights and found a Polish publisher and published this beautiful edition with an extraordinary Polish illustrations of the sixpence that ran away. I said earlier that we don't do very much inbound translation, but we do a little. So here on the right, you can see an image of Asterix August Cleopatra, which was translated into Irish, and we were pleased to support that work. So how do you represent Ireland abroad? Well, it's a rather open question and there are no easy answers. We don't actually get involved with the choices, the design choices of the publishers. We do try to operate at arm's length. And we very seldom get involved unless there are errors of fact in the representation on the cover. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But here you can see three completely different jackets, different types of representation of Ireland. On the left, you can see a collection of fairy tales which were published in Chinese. And what's interesting here is that even the illustrations in the original text are most unusual. They are not images that would make you immediately think of Ireland. But an Irish illustrator created them, and the Chinese publisher decided that he liked those images and has represented them in his Chinese version of the book. The book in the center of the screen was not actually supported by Literature Ireland, but Ireland Literature Exchange at the time was involved in the promotion of Irish literature in France in 1996. It was a year of focus on Irish writing. And I just thought that this particular collection of writing and the jacket, the cover image, represents another, perhaps slightly sentimental representation of Ireland. That little girl looks lovely, but is that does it immediately make you think of Ireland? I think it probably does. The red hair. Should we mind? I don't think so. I think actually different countries relate to Ireland differently, have different images of it, and it's our role to ensure that the best of Irish writing is translated to the highest standards, and as broad a range of Irish writing is represented abroad. On the right, you have a collection of women's poetry edited by Clíona Riordáin. It's a bilingual anthology, and it presents Irish women poets. It's a little bit ahead of its time, actually, because it was published in the mid, well, in 2013, 2014. Are we running out of time? We've almost run out of time. I just wanted to show you this image of an ad which we carried in the book fair, in the bookseller for the Frankfurt Book Fair. And the reason I wanted to show it to you is that just it shows a cross section of titles that we supported recently. Sinead Gleason's Constellations in Chinese in the top right, and then books from Argentina, Germany, Greece, Germany again, France. There's a great deal happening. It's our privilege to do it, to support the work. We would probably do double the work if we were able to, if we had the resources. Certainly the demand is there. And finally, there's a picture of the Frankfurt Book Fair 2021 when we were busy promoting Irish literature to the world. So thank you.
Hi, Sinead. That was such a wonderful talk. You do such wonderful work. Those were such beautiful covers as well. I was so surprised. Everyone seemed so much more beautiful than the last. I have to say I was a bit surprised. Speaking of translations, there was a moment there where I was really surprised by the commitment of Literature Ireland, because you said something about Seamus Heaney writing about Thatcher, and you introduced the translator to Thatcher. And I was thinking, now, how did they manage to get Margaret Thatcher to meet Seamus Heaney's translator? I couldn't believe it. But anyway, that might have been a little... You yes, but I mean, they both could have, I'm sure he's written about both. Yeah, she definitely knew about him anyway. I suppose you gave us so much there, but I'd be very interested to hear about this process of somebody has this idea, maybe a translator, and could you maybe speak, if there's anything you've missed, maybe speak through this process of how somebody arrives with this idea of seeing this wonderful Irish book and they want to bring it back home to their language. How does this process happen?
How does it work? Well, you're quite right to mention the translator, because sometimes indeed it is the translator who has the vision and who wants to bring the book to their language territory. More often than not, though, it's publishers who are specialized, I suppose, in the publication of literature in translation. And they want to bring the literature of other countries to their readers. There's quite a lot of risk involved in that. It's not like publishing a local writer, because quite often the writer is known, you have the cost of translation, you have the cost of acquiring the rights to publish that translator in your language. And that may not be as easy as you might expect. I was talking to a French publisher yesterday who had wanted to translate a particular writer, put in a bid of €6,000 for this particular book, and was beaten by another publisher who obviously paid more in order to acquire this Irish writer and publish their work in translation. So we're delighted because it means that the writer will receive an income as a result of this. So basically, a publisher normally acquires the rights to a work of literature. They decide that they're going to publish this in their catalogue, in their list. The lead time can be, usually, I suppose, nowadays it's faster than it used to be. So it would normally be 6 to 12 months, which gives time to commission a translation and to do some advanced publicity about the work, to edit the translation, and to bring the book to market, to actually launch the book. Sometimes there's promotional elements subsequent to that, and the writer is invited to attend a book festival or to do signings in a bookshop, give press interviews, and that varies from territory to territory. In terms of Literature Ireland's involvement, what we do is we offer a translation grant program. Applications can be done online, so that makes life rather easy, particularly in these COVID times. And we ask that the publisher, the applicant publisher, proves that they have acquired the rights to the book. So they have to buy the rights from either a literary agent or the originating publisher. That varies from title to title, author to author. And the reason this is so important is that otherwise you could have two publishers publishing the same book in the same territory at the same time. So it actually is a legal minefield if the rights are not acquired by one publisher. So we ask that the publisher prove that they've acquired those rights. We also ask them that they will submit a sample translation, because we want to check the quality of the translation and make sure that it's of as high a standard as possible. We ask them to send us the CV of the translator and a contract with the translator, because we want to make sure that the translator is paid as well as possible. And fair remuneration is a huge issue for literary translators. It's very easy for a translator to be exploited. And this is very specialized work. It requires a huge amount of input on the part of the translator and on the part of the publisher, because there are risks and costs involved in literary translation that are not there if you're publishing in your own territory, in your own language. And then we send the sample out for assessment to an independent expert reader. We pay that reader a small fee to check the sample. We check all the paperwork. I'm very lucky in my small but very expert team who do this work. And the report is sent back. I read the report and make a recommendation to the Board of Literature Ireland with regard to the level of subsidy that we can afford to award to that publisher. The levels of subsidy vary. It's rarely enough. It's a contribution to the translation costs. And it varies depending on our strategic priorities. There are certain territories where we really want to see more work. So we're very keen at the moment to see more work in Arabic languages, in Arabic territories. We've been focusing on China for a long time. But we're also keen to see, for example, younger writers having their works translated. It's easier for writers who are more established. If they've been a success once, then the likelihood is that the publishing house will want to repeat the experience and to take on further books. But for a young writer, it can be quite tricky to break in and to be translated across the world. So we're there to support that. And also, Ireland's a very small country. The possible income streams for writers here are limited. The market here is very small. So if we can help by creating an income stream for a writer because of their sales in Argentina or Germany, of course, or China, well, that's wonderful. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it completely answers it. It was a wonderful answer. Yes. Yeah, I mean, you really walked us through that whole process, I suppose. And yeah, these income streams are so useful to writers. You know, you can only be Maynooth writer in residence once every 2 or 3 years, I suppose. I am kind of furthering the question of, you've been working in Literature Ireland for some time, just out of kind of personal curiosity, has anything really surprised you? Now, it could be a success, but it could just be something else. What has surprised you in the last while with your work in Literature Ireland?
I think one of the things that really has struck me is that the diversity of languages and the diversity of interests across Europe in particular is quite fascinating. You know, work can do really, really well in one country and not at all well in another, even if it's being well published in both countries. Just to give you an example, there was a book by Maeve Brennan called The Visitor, and it sold 22,000 copies in Italy, sold 2,500 in Germany. Both translations were to a very high standard. Both publishers did their level best to produce good books for the market and to develop a readership for that text. And both publishers believed in the book. But taste can play a huge factor in this. And the richness and the diversity of European countries and European readerships fascinates me. Another thing, I suppose, that has really struck me is that most translators subsidize the work they do. They spend hours trying to get something just right. They're very, very expert. They're very committed to what they do, but they're seldom paid enough for the work that they do.
I suppose, I don't know, how could you address that imbalance? So, I mean, you look at a book in a bookshop in Ireland, and you might not even know it's translated. You might have to go very, very into the copyright page and see under some symbol that it's translated. What, in your opinion, do you think there is ways of maybe acknowledging or paying translators better? What would that look like, could I ask you?
Major subsidy across the board to national agencies such as ours. I mean, I'm not sure that authors are paid enough either. I mean, it's complicated. It's a complicated ecology. I suppose if translators are paid better, then the likelihood is they will have more time to spend on translations, and that will enhance the quality of the translations. And so the books will be even better. You asked me what else had struck me in recent times, and I suppose the thing that really has struck me is just the sheer volume and quality of contemporary Irish literature. There's so much. It's a really golden age. Every day there's something else to be read and promoted. And so it's a huge privilege to work in this area at present. I'm thinking, I mean, without wanting to name names, but I mean, you think of, you know, Elaine Feeney, Ronan Hession, Sarah Gilmartin, Sally Rooney, of course, Colin Barrett. The names go on and on and on. There's so much happening. It's great.
Brilliant. That's, yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. I suppose you've been working in this field with Irish writers and then internationally. Over the last, maybe, I'm going to pick a random time, let's say 10 years or something like this. Have you seen any change in the awareness of translated works? So that has two parts to that question. I suppose, do you see Irish literature becoming more a kind of global brand, to use this marketing language, or getting bigger? And then on the vice versa, do you think that Irish readers are becoming more or less open to translated works?
I think I might answer the second part of that question first. I think there's definitely been a climate change. There's been a shift, both in Britain and in Ireland. Quite a lot of translated work is now being read and enjoyed. Sometimes my Swedish colleagues sort of say, well, of course, this all started with the success of the crime. Swedish crime opened the doors to the reading of literature and translation. But there have always been people who've enjoyed reading literature in translation. I just think there was a slightly fallow period when not enough of it was being published. But, you know, you think of Christopher McElhoe's and Harville Press and the publication of The Leopard in English, Il Gatto Pardo translated into English. Right through the 60s and 70s, there was work being read and enjoyed in translation. You think further back, you think of, you know, Proust or Chekhov. We've always had translations that have formed part of our reading. I think also it's very important to say that the Irish language has been particularly open to translation, even at times when the English language publishing scene, both in Britain and Ireland, wasn't as active. I've been struck by the Irish language publishers who've chosen to publish works in translation. Publishers like Kashkaim and more recently Fata Fata. Fata Fata is about to publish a novel. Well, I think they've just published it. I'm not sure if it's out or about to appear, a translation of a novel by Yasmina Kadra. But that's pretty extraordinary. A novel by the Hungarian novelist Sandor Mare has been published in Irish recently. So there's quite a dynamic scene there. I suppose it would be nice to see more works from other countries being published in Ireland in translation. It's a very small market, and it's important that it's well funded, because the market is small and it is hard to be viable as a publisher in this country. But in terms of a broad ecology, in terms of making works available for Irish writers to read, I think it is absolutely to be recommended that work be published in translation. It has to be a two-way exchange, and that enriches the experience for everybody. You asked me about Irish literature as a brand internationally, and that sense of Irish literature traveling. I think the work we do certainly supports that. I mean, we're delighted to see work appear in Chinese, in Japanese, in Argentinian Spanish. We could, given the quality and the volume of the work, particularly at present, we could, had we the resources, support probably 3 times as many titles as we do. It is extraordinary, the demand that is there for Irish literature. And it's a huge compliment that people find something in what we say that resonates with them. And it's not always the same thing. So you have writers who are very successful in particular territories and simply don't cross the radar in others. And that's fine too, I suppose. I mean, again, it goes back to this question of, you know, cultural difference and cultural diversity and taste. But the people in the process, the translators, the rights sellers, the booksellers, they all play a part in that book chain, and anything we can do to support them, we should do.
Yeah, fantastic. I agree. If anyone is watching, you must fund Literature Ireland more. I think this is
translation. Yeah, Literature Ireland.
Yeah, but it's the channel through which these things happen. That's very interesting. I feel sometimes you feel very lucky to be Irish because you have these. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat there. Sometimes you feel very lucky because you're kind of in this nest, this Irish nest, where, you know, people like you and your organization are taking care of the Irish writer insofar as you're able to allow this thing to flow outward. Now, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but when I was kind of looking into it about 6 or 7 years ago, when I was living abroad and things like this, and I'd go into bookshops, I was always so stunned by how much of the work in bookshops is translated there. You're approaching a figure of maybe 50% in a place like Germany or France of the works are translated. Whereas in the Anglosphere, not just Ireland, I think it's much lower than that.
I think it is much lower. I think one thing that struck me a couple of years ago when I was thinking about this is that the Anglosphere is very, very big. You know, if you think of all the wonderful work that comes out of India, that comes out of New Zealand, that comes out of Australia, that comes out of Britain, of course, that comes out of the US, and you add it all up, and not to forget, of course, the extraordinary work that's coming out of Ireland. You add all that up, it is a huge world of its own with diverse inputs. So yes, you could argue that that the Anglosphere is very closed, but you could also argue that, well, actually, it has a lot of stimulus and diversity within it. I do think there's been a shift, though. I mean, if you look at Charco Press, if you look at And Other Stories, if you look at Fitzcarraldo, if you look at the Nobel Prize winners in recent times who have published in languages other than English, Olga Tokarczuk and so on, you know, it all adds up, and you begin to think, gosh, there is a shift here. There is something happening. People are interested in reading literature and translation.
I think I've noticed that as well. I mean, it's kind of like you mentioned with that wonderful book by De Lampedusa, the Leopard. There has always been this space for big hits, you might call them, or big texts coming through and having a big impact. But maybe a little bit I've noticed over the last 4 or 5 years that it's becoming more constant, like maybe every year a larger translated work will happen. So maybe this will continue, you know, this translation, and including the Irish language. I've noticed much more interest in it recently. And, you know, every Irish speaker, I think, is an English speaker. So we'll see what happens there. But I'm going to ask you, you know, I'm really excited to see what you guys are doing next. And it'll be so interesting to see how these things commence. But I suppose before I hand you back to Rita, I want to ask for you, who's been working in this field for so long, what do you think is at stake in the issue of literary translation? Like, what's going on here, I suppose?
Well, reading a book is a very private and individual activity, and I see works in translation as Trojan horses that enter into people's minds and hearts, without wanting to sound too schmaltzy about it, but that do influence people, that help them form a relationship with another place, with another country, with another time. And that's an incredibly powerful tool and an incredibly exciting possibility. So I think literary translation is crucial for any country that wants to speak to other people and speak in a deep way. It's not sound bites. It's a whole world that's been created by a writer and that is now entering into somebody's mind. It's an extraordinary thing. And the fact that translation can make that happen across languages and across geographic boundaries is extraordinary. It's really wonderful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sinead. I learned so much there, and it was so interesting to hear. I'm going to hand you back to the MC, Rita, Sakr.
That's so cool. Thank you, Oisín. It was such a pleasure to hear you both. Thank you for those thought-provoking. I've thought about translation in all sorts of ways, but not in this broad way. So I have questions for you both to close our conversation. Oisín, obviously in the history of thought and literary production, translation has been linked to both relationality and violence. But in your own work, issues of translation are quite prominent, and the failure of translation is sometimes fatal. One of the characters in Nobber is a translator. So can you tell us a little bit more about the significance of these issues in your work?
Okay. I suppose, I mean, I wouldn't be too idealistic in thinking that violence is always an issue of translation. You know, I'd be maybe a bit more materialist in that. Most cultural exchange isn't violent in any way, you know, but I do think that, especially prior to the 20th century, that you would have these translator figures coming into places, and they would be maybe beacons of a different type of life, maybe a type of empire or something like this. And I think translation becomes very difficult when it is linked to concepts rather than goods, so maybe ways of life. So I think very often, and this is just an example, I think very often there was this very famous case in the 19th century that Flann O'Brien based part of the Portmouth off on Béal Bucht, where this Irish man was brought to court and he went on he was being, I forget what the crime was, but he was being charged of a crime. And he was asked to give a reply, and this is all in English, and he gave his reply in Irish, and he spoke for 2 hours. And the judge said, what did he say? And the lawyer said, he said not guilty, sir. So I just mean, I think some things are very easy to translate, but when you go into different ways of seeing the world, that's when the risk gets higher. And I think I'd like to reflect that some ways in my work. And I'll finally finish with, certain concepts can't be translated, but another thing I think is really interesting is I wonder if mistranslations can be translated. You know what I mean? Like these productive mistranslations as well, which maybe my next book will be about, but that's my blah, blah answer.
And you're supposed to finish that book in your next residence, or?
No, the money's running out at the end of this one, so it better be done by now.
There are questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask you a question, Sinead, that's really close to my heart and my interest. It's a bit of a selfish question, but you brought it up earlier. So I'm going to ask you about Literature Ireland's recent engagement and various initiatives involving the Arabic language and the Arab world. And it would be great to hear from you about the history of this engagement, why it really happened from the start, and its future trajectories, maybe.
Of course. Well, it is very close to our heart too. We're very conscious that not that much work has been translated into Arabic. We've been working with some Egyptian publishers, and they've translated a range of work. I met an Egyptian publisher at the Leipzig Book Fair about 12 years ago, and I introduced him to an author, and he liked her work. And about 7 years later, he published her very first novel, Tatty. So that was Christine Dwyer-Hickey. So that's how it began. We have since worked with that publisher and supported a very fine short story writer from Belfast called Wendy Erskine, whose first collection of stories is just out in Arabic. And also Jan Carson's The Firestarters, which has come out in Arabic. Chloe Khanouch has worked with a number of Egyptian publishers, different Egyptian publishers, and is about to have Crane Killer, I think, appear in Arabic, which is extraordinary. So Martin Klein's novel is appearing in Arabic. And some of Louis Dupuer's work is coming out in Arabic. So we've been slowly building a presence in Egypt. It's small, but these things take a very long time. I mean, you can't wave a magic wand and create a large footprint of Irish literature in any territory. We've been looking at other things as well, though. We were conscious that Expo Dubai was coming up. So I approached the Department of Foreign Affairs some years ago and said, look, I could, and I'm interested in doing this, I could edit an anthology of short stories and make those available in time for Expo Dubai. So literally last week, a consignment of that anthology was delivered to Dubai via Sharjah. So that's very exciting. We've also been looking at, and this is in progress, it hasn't been completed yet, but I know, Rita, you've helped a little in the background in terms of cultural choices, I suppose, there. we've been looking at preparing some postcards of Irish poetry in Arabic translation. And that's a very exciting project that's in development. We've worked with a Moroccan translator on those poems. And we've also had some meetings with the Moroccan ambassador to Ireland, and are hopeful that in 2022 we will host a Moroccan translator in residence in Ireland. So the work is ongoing, but it's very exciting. The cultural differences are enormous, and but that's one great advantage we have is that classical Arabic is the same everywhere. So it doesn't matter whether we're working with Lebanon or Morocco or somewhere in the Middle East. It should work for us, and that's a huge advantage. And it might pay dividends as well in terms of having a book translated and published in a given territory and then exported to bookshops elsewhere within the Arab world. So without wanting to sound like I'm banging the funding drum, but if we had enough money, we would love to host a group of Arabic language publishers in Ireland and to introduce them to the culture and to the local publishers and writers. It nearly happened with one Egyptian publisher a couple of years ago, and then COVID intervened. So we'll get there eventually.
That's exciting, and I hope there'll be more money. It's interesting that you mentioned this pivot to Egypt, because it used to be Beirut.
Yes.
And the thriving publishing industry there, but of course the economic crisis has affected the entire literary and cultural environment, and particularly that vibrant publishing industry. But Egypt has this very long tradition, like Beirut, in translation and multilingualism. So that's very good to hear. There's a question from Rosanna to both Sinéad and Oisín. Rosanna, who's doing the MA at Maynooth, asks, which aspects of Irish literature do you personally find most meaningful to share to the rest of the world?
What a question. Oisín, would you like to take that first while I think about it?
Oh God, yeah, you've got to be political about it. Well, you know, I've been reading Irish literature for a long time, so you kind of go through different phases. And it actually is rich enough that you can leave it behind for 2 or 3 years and then go back and discover new things. So I suppose 2 or 3 years ago, I was very moved by the kind of anonymous Irish poems that had appeared in whatever century, we don't know, but they'd appeared with the monastic tradition between the 8th century and the 14th century. And then I kind of left that behind. And now very recently, I've just been shocked by the quality of fantasy and Gothic Irish literature from the 19th century and the 18th century. So, I mean, is that Irish? I don't know, but I've been rereading a lot Sheridan Le Fanu and Anna Radcliffe and people like this, and it's really, I mean, they're so good, you know. Lord Dunsany, who's barely in print now, or Mr. Dunsany as we call him, but really this kind of fantasy Gothic stuff that I don't know if it's so much present, but it really is of a very high standard. I definitely recommend to anyone watching this to read a book of short stories called In a Glass Darkly by Sheridan Le Fanu. It's one of the best horror books I've ever read. That's
one
me.
answer, I'm not sure I can emulate that. I think for me, what is extraordinary is when something that is really, really culturally specific is adopted, and somebody in a very far-flung country takes it to heart. You know, when you receive in the post a book of, say, Darren Ní Grief's book, A Ghost in the Throat, and something that is so Irish, so specific to this culture. And yet somebody in France or Italy or elsewhere has decided this speaks to me, and I want this to speak to my readers. It's very seldom done for the money. That's an act of cultural exchange that is quite extraordinary and to be, celebrated. A bit like you, I think short stories have extraordinary power. I'm involved at the moment of the project with UNESCO City of Literature, Dublin, UNESCO, Dublin City of Literature, Dublin UNESCO City of Literature. And what I've been doing is selecting short stories that will be published in Portuguese, in Óbidos, in Quebec, in 2 cities in Korea, and in Reykjavik, and choosing the stories that I, with almost 20 years experience in this world, feel might resonate with people in those territories. It's just a huge privilege and great fun to do. And I suppose the knowledge that you're putting a message in a bottle, you're sending something off and you don't quite know where it's going to land is hugely exciting as well. I don't think that's a question, does it?
I think lots of thoughts have gone into answering the question throughout the conversation, really, from that story about the Thatcher onwards. There's a comment. Thank you both, Sinead and Oisín, for such an interesting conversation. Sinead, thank you very much for appreciating a translator's work. It's encouraging to know that your work is valued. And Oisín, thank you for Nobber. Yes, we should all thank you for Nobber. Oisín, this is a great novel, which I hope to translate into Russian someday. That's the comment, not to me translating in Russian.
Thank you, PS.
So you
get in
should
contact with Sinead.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Sinead and Oisín, for such a wonderful conversation. Join us next week for the last webinar in our series. I will be talking to Alison Lyons and Chidi Ukwu about some exciting intercultural partnerships emerging between Dublin and Abuja, Nigeria, and what it means to be a creative city of literature. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.